Welcome to episode 2 of the BV podcast for April 2025. As always, your select insight into life here in the delightful county of Dorset. Hello from me, Terry Bennett.
And hello from me, Jenny Devitt.
In this episode, I speak to Jim Freer of Sturminster Newton, who's recently reached a remarkable milestone, his 100th birthday.
We'll hear farmer George Hosford's angry reaction to the sudden stopping by the government of the sustainable farming incentive payments and what he thinks that could mean for British farming.
Even in these times of rapid advances in medical science and the commensurate increases in life expectancy, fewer than 1% of men live to the age of 100. Jim Freer of Sturminster Newton is one of that relatively small number, and having recently celebrated that remarkable milestone, I visited him to talk about his life and the changes he's seen over the years. Today I'm in Sturminster Newton at the rather lovely Newstone House care home to talk to Jim Freer, who has recently turned 100 years old. So Jim, first of all, congratulations.
Thank you very much.
I'm bound to ask you that really obvious question. What do you put down your longevity to?
I really don't know. I suppose, first of all, I'd probably have to thank my parents. Because I think they did a good job and put the genes in the right order. You know, that from a physical and mental point of view, I think was good. Yeah, so I think that was one thing. The other very important thing is, of course, luck. And luck plays a part in everyone's life. And it certainly played quite a part in mine. There's no question about that during the wartime period and beyond, I think, because I've always found that somehow or other luck is there with the people you meet and the things that you do with the things that you say. So perhaps it's genes and luck.
Well, that's a great combination. We'll come on to talk about your wartime experience in a moment. But let's just go back a little. You were born, well, obviously 100 years ago. Whereabouts? It was in the north somewhere, wasn't it?
No, Midlands, in the East Midlands, at a town called Desborough, which was almost on the border of Leicestershire and Northamptonshire. That was my birthplace and where I had my early schooling.
And memories of your childhood, a happy time was that?
Oh yes, very happy times really. I mean, I think there again we were lucky in as much that my mother and her sister owned neighbouring properties, and she was in the business of a nursery for not for children but for growing things. And we had a very open life where they had animals. They were sort of agricultural and horticultural people. And I think that sort of provided a basis for us, really, as children, to take advantage of the freedom and so on. So it was a good period.
What was the plan? Did you have a particular direction in life that you'd planned? I mean, it got a little bit hijacked, obviously, by the war, but what were you planning to do?
Well, I think I was always interested in engineering and sort of practical work, metal work and woodwork. I did at early school, and that somehow grabbed me, I think. It certainly provided an interest, and I looked to that later on in life, really. My first job was in an engineering company, and I suppose my first job really was probably making tea and taking the dog for a walk. But supposedly it was a drawing office, and then it led to interest with design and again with engineering. So that was really the basis.
And that was the Harbour Aircraft Company, wasn't
right.
it?
Yes, indeed. Yes, that was.
And you joined there at 17 and a half, but this is, by then, the early part of the 40s, wasn't it? So the country was at war at that point.
That's right.
How did you get involved? Did you join up voluntarily?
Oh, yes, indeed. Recruits obviously were required for the Air Force and the other military units and so on. And the obvious thing I said that every lad wanted, probably at that time, was to get into aircrew. And that had to be a volunteer situation. In other words, no aircrew were ever put in the air except volunteers.
I see. So at round about the age of 18, I suppose, you were then in the RAF training to be an airman.
Yes, indeed. As all volunteers for aircrew want to be pilots, I wanted to be a pilot, but at the selection board, I suppose probably because of my interest in engineering and the previous experience and knowledge, that they decided that I should be a flight engineer rather than a pilot, navigator or air bomber. That, of course, led me into a very interesting training period dealing with engines and airframes. That was at the Technical Training Command Unit at Scathing in South Wales. That was really all the training, pre-training. The next stage was the flying part.
Which I suppose for any trainee in the RAF is the more exciting part. You're getting up in the air and actually being out there. How long did the training take? I mean, you were then a flight engineer. What did that involve?
So the ground training was around about 9 months, that sort of period. And after the initial ITW, initial training wing, which was, I suppose, probably more general subject. And after the period at St Athan, of course, I went on to join a crew. Interesting thing there, because the Canadians had decided to send over a complete bomber group from Canada to help us, really, and an area of North Yorkshire was laid available to them to set up the group, and a number of stations and squadrons were selected to take over that area and to be the primary bomber group for attacking Germany and France. That was, I suppose, probably the unusual thing that happened, really, was that the crews from Canada came over without flight engineers, because their crews were prepared for twin-engined aircraft, twin-engine bomber aircraft, and that's what they were trained for in Canada. And of course, when they arrived over here, the four-engined aircraft were becoming available in fairly large numbers and required a flight engineer to be part of the crew.
Was that the Lancasters?
Well, there were Lancasters, and they were a very important aircraft. But we were allocated Halifax aircraft, well, two types. We flew, one with Merlin engines and one with Bristol Hercules engines. I will always say that the Halifax is the better of the two aircraft, and that the Hercules is the better of the two engines. But that was, just a feeling and part of the experience, I suppose. The crews had already been to establish a base in the UK as an operational training unit, OTU, and then they went to heavy conversion units to be joined by a flight engineer and then to do training on the four-engined aircraft prior to getting into action.
There came a point, obviously, when you were pressed into active service, and I think you did over 30 sorties through your flying experience. Is that the right number?
Yes, indeed. Actually, I think we actually took off about 34 times, and fortunately landed 34 times as well. But one of the sorties that we were sent on, we had a recall, so we didn't really get further than the edge of the North Sea, I think, probably. I would say, though, that the Canadian airmen and everyone that I met on these stations were volunteers from Canada. And I think that was a very important thing. They all had the right idea. They all had a positive objective to do a job. The crew that I joined, and they chose me, but that was a bit of luck, I think, were very good people, very well-trained people, and nice lads, and very experienced.
It's obviously one thing to be very well-trained and to have very good people, but it's a very risky environment, isn't it, whichever way you look at it. And, I mean, in the article you talk about there being 1,000 Allied aircraft involved at one point,
Yes,
a great danger of you actually suffering friendly fire, as they call it these days.
Yes, indeed, and
so
that did happen. That did happen quite a bit, really, and it's that was one of the hazards, really. But I suppose it was the The idea really was to get the maximum effect in one particular area, and that was the choice that Bomber Command made.
I'm bound to ask a slightly trite question. What about the fear? You're in a very, very risky situation. You're very young still.
Yes.
Were you afraid, or was that just not a factor?
Not really afraid. I mean, I suppose there's a basic fear somewhere there, but we were trained to do something and we set out to do something. And when you took off, you realised that, you were sitting on probably about 5 tons of bombs and 2,500 gallons of aviation kerosene. So, there was obviously a tenseness, but because the crew were well trained and they had a job to do, in other words, there was no time for doing anything else. You had to be doing your job all the time. The navigator had to be doing his job all the time. The pilot, the rear gunner had his job to do, to keep his eyes open and so on and so forth. So we all had a task. And I think to get into that task and to actually do it, then your concentration or your fear tends to disappear.
I think that's the story. So often people say you haven't really got time to dwell on it. You just need to get on with the task in hand, really,
That's
don't
right.
you? Anyway, the end of the war came and you were demobbed, presumably in 1945, 46, thereabouts.
1947 actually,
47.
because on the day that we did our last operation, I think was sometime in September 44. One of the first operations was D-Day, of course. The Canadian crew, within days, were sent back to Canada after completing their tour of operations. They'd done their job and that was it. I think the pilot was given the DFC and off they went back to Canada. So the thing is, well, what did the Air Ministry do with flight engineers that haven't got a home?
And what did they do?
Well, they sent me on a signals course for about 5 or 6 weeks, and we were told that more signals officers were required in the Far East because that was coming up to the period between VE and VJ. At the end of that course, we were posted to India to take up the signals post. And when we arrived, we were told that they had more signals officers than they needed. So therefore, we were almost redundant. And the idea was that it would be nice to come back home. But that didn't happen. Morale of the forces at that particular time in the Far East, of course, and particularly soon after then VJ Day came and everyone wanted to get home. And morale was quite low, really, because, people were every day were wanting to get in touch with their families and tell them when they would be coming home and so on and so forth. So a section called RAF Post was set up in order to improve the postal service between Far East and the UK. This was the idea of Louis Mountbatten, who was actually C&C there at the time. And so we were in the business then of setting up a unit to collect mail as quickly as possible from all the stations, outstations and so on, get it into the primary areas, New Delhi, Bombay, Karachi and Calcutta. And the RAF post then operated from there with aircraft just doing the job of bringing mail back and forth from the Far East and the UK. I left the RAF finally in 1947.
And you married Pat in 1950, I believe.
Yes.
Where did you meet Pat? Was she anything to do with the RAF or just totally unconnected?
No, I met her actually in the company that I'd worked with. The company had actually moved from Market Harbour to Maidenhead. Pat was working in as a secretary in the sales unit, And because I was in engineering and the works part, so we got together. We hit it off, as the saying goes.
Anyway, you went back to the Harbour Aircraft Company, as you say, in Maidenhead, but you eventually got itchy feet and came to this part of the world, down to Alan Cobham Engineering, is that right, in Blandford?
That's right, yes. Well, I spent quite a long time with the Harbour Aircraft people at Harbour before the war, but they had a subsidiary company called British Filters, and that was the company that was established in Maidenhead. So actually I came back to a Maidenhead-based unit. Yeah, I had quite a good time with them. Things went very well. We moved a factory from Maidenhead to Marlow. I can't remember exactly when. Eventually, I got to the job of production director, and I felt that I couldn't really go much further in that one. So looked around for jobs, obviously. The job at Alan Cobham was offered, and I applied for that and got it. So there again, a bit of luck, perhaps,
And quite a bit of ability, I suspect.
Yes.
So you moved to this part of the world. Much different in Dorset?
Well, yes, I mean, Dorset is a lovely place to be, and in fact, moving into a brand new factory in Blandford was quite a joy. It's very good. I started off just as works manager, and we were trying to bring the two parts of Alan Cobham Engineering together. There was the part on Tarrant Rushton Airfield, where they were based there, and also another unit actually in Blandford, in the area of Eagle House.
But you spent 8 years with Alan Cobham, I believe, and then finally decided to retire. So you've actually been retired about 30 years now, I believe.
That's right. Now, ask me what I did during 30 years. I don't know.
That was my next question.
It was very enjoyable, I'll say that. Well, there's lots of things that you get involved in, I suppose. My wife was certainly interested in archaeology and in museum activities and so on. So she became a steward in the museum in Blandford. And that was a very enjoyable time. She enjoyed it very much, and I went along as well. And I think that what I was able to do for them was to renovate certain items that had been submitted to them to make them in their original condition, or as near to that as possible, so that they could be exhibited. So we had an involvement there, and of course there was village involvement with gardening clubs and so on and so forth. Each year we, for quite a few years, we ran the summer fete and got that underway. I suppose mainly sort of village activities, but a bit more than that, because we were able to explore Dorset. And I think that was one of the very interesting parts of that part of the life. It was very interesting indeed.
I'm bound to ask you, not that many people make 3 figures, even now. Life expectancy is getting better, but still not that many people make 100. Looking back over that lifetime, you've seen a huge amount of change. Much of it for the better, or do you look back on some of it and think, well, maybe it's not as good as it used to be in some respects?
It's an awkward question, really, because it is very mixed. I mean, certain things are very good. From a medical point of view, I think great strides have been made to help people with very serious injuries and ailments. But on the other hand, there are certain things that I think are not good. I mean, I'm not wild about social media, but to be absolutely honest, I don't know. I mean, you can think about lots of subjects. You think about transport, for example, and the fact that yes, okay, when I was a lad, it was horses and carts in the streets, sort of thing. At that time, I imagine that no one ever thought of something in the air like Concorde, for example, that can almost beat time. So there are so many aspects of good and bad. I'm pleased to have lived through the period that I did live through.
One final question then. Advice to young people, thinking about teenagers that are coming to the end of their formal education and looking to move into the world of work. What's your sort of general advice to younger people to have a happy and fulfilling life?
I think that perhaps to respect standards and discipline is an important thing. I know that's a very general sort of statement, but I think that perhaps children, because of the digital age, they're able to move way ahead of the basic principles of life, really. How to get on with people, how to improve their own life, and also to look after themselves physically as well. And I think that's important, to be involved in sport. It's also very important to be active in what I would call teamwork. In other words, to be able to work with people to produce effects. Yeah, that's probably about it, I think.
And I think you said in the article, be nice to each other.
I did indeed, yes, but I think that's a good thing too. Yes.
Jim, thank you for talking to us on the BV podcast. It's been a great joy to talk to you.
You're very welcome indeed.
In line with a number of other controversial and unpopular budget cuts, the government, in the shape of DEFRA, the Department for the Environment, Farming and Rural Affairs, a few weeks ago abruptly put a stop to the SFI payments to farmers. SFI, or the Sustainable Farming Incentive, was relatively new and provided subsidies designed to make British farming more environmentally friendly. Like many farmers, Derwestern farmer George Hosford and his brother Dougal have used government subsidies to make up for leaving stretches of land, alongside hedges for instance, out of food production and given over to help our increasingly threatened wildlife. George, like many Dorset farmers and farmers elsewhere, is both very angry and very disappointed at this sudden stopping of the SFI. I asked him to explain just what exactly sustainable farming is understood to mean.
Well, sustainable farming incentive sounds to me like it means that they are trying to encourage farmers to use methods which take regard for long-term health of our productive system, so that rather than eroding the value of the soil's productive capacity by questionable methods, we use methods that maintain and, if not, build up the productive capacity of our soils and systems. So there is a difference between sustainable and regenerative. And regenerative, although a lot of people raise their eyebrows at the term regenerative, to us, regenerative is where we need to be, not just sustainable. Sustainable implies just keeping it where it is, whereas regenerative means that we are putting effort into rebuilding our productive capacity.
So one maintains the status quo effectively, and the other improves the land and, most importantly, the soil.
Indeed it does. That's crucial to us. But the intention with the government, at least it's a good start to use the word sustainable, I would say, because many people around the world, many farmers around the world will be using systems which are degrading, eroding our productive capacity, and that is not good for the future of the human race or the planet or diversity or anything. So I think sustainable means, to me and to many farmers, not only about the productive capacity but the effect it has on the food production has on the environment, wildlife, diversity, cleanliness of water, healthiness of ecological systems, all comes into, I would say, all need to come into sustainable systems.
So it's about really encouraging farmers to think differently about their farming practices and about the land and the value of the soil.
Yes, and I think, well, maybe not...
And so make that mental transition.
Maybe not necessarily differently, because that can frighten people off. So it means thinking about how you produce, and we've done a lot of thinking about how we produce over the years. There have been a number of schemes. The LEAF, I seem to remember in my own personal development, the LEAF, the Linking Environment and Farming movement or scheme, accreditation scheme it was and still is, helped me think more about this, because it started back in the day with quite complicated questionnaires about every aspect of your farming, how you deal with your recycling, what thought process you put into using agrochemicals, how you decide what kind of cultivations you use, what you put in your rotation, all those sorts of things came into the leaf sustainability audit. And that an awful lot of what they did then, we're talking 20 or 30 years ago, is now present in the schemes that are now being used to persuade us to farm in a more sustainable fashion. So it's not actually anything new, and it's what I would say is what proper farming should be, because as a custodian of the land, you should always have one eye at the very least on the future. You're never farming for today, you're always farming for tomorrow, next week, and next year, and 5 years down the line. And I could add more on that topic if we got on to talking the politics of tenant farming, because modern tenancies, as I may have mentioned to you before, encourage farmers to take the best from their land over the short term, because they've no idea whether they're going to have control of that land or access to that land in 10 years' time.
It is all about thinking long term, and we know that politicians are notoriously bad at thinking long term. And you have to if you're working with the land or with the forests or anything like that at all. And if you have a short term tenancy, of course, then you will be encouraged just to milk the land for all it's worth.
Absolutely, it's blindingly obvious, isn't it? You're quite right, which is regrettable. And if you could put the right structures in place with longer tenancies and fair methods of sharing out the land between different farmers, rather than it being blind competition between people who've got the most money to splash out on the ego-boosting access to another 500 or 1,000 acres, we need to get away from that model if we possibly can, and it needs to be all about who's going to farm the land in the most responsible and productive. We can't lose sight of the fact that it needs to be. We need to be productive because we've got a population to feed.
Absolutely. Let's leave tenancy
sorry, I couldn't
aside
resist
for the moment. Okay. So setting tenancies aside for the moment, before the SFI there was the BPS, another acronym, which was the Basic Payment Scheme, which was an EU subsidy. Now, did that cover the same things as the SFI?
Oh, not remotely. The SFI has far more breadth and depth to it. You had to obey a number of rules to qualify for the basic payment, and there was a thing called cross-compliance, which had a number of rules to it, and some of that was to do with basic things to do with how you treat your soils, but it also included things like not cultivating too close to hedges and various other things for all perfectly good environmental reasons. So those rules have had to have been rolled into general rules governing farming completely. They've been made into law basically outside of any scheme, whereas previously you were bound into those agreements by the money they were going to pay you for the BPS. But I don't have any argument with that because they're all fairly basic level things. But the BPS itself didn't cover you for a fraction of the myriad of different options you can now do through the SFI. Although those things, say we're talking about growing bird food plots, for example. For many years, you've been able to grow bird food plots through schemes that ran alongside BPS. So the BPS came from the EU, but there was an alternative strand of funding, which I now can't remember the term for, which meant that national governments could run their own environmental schemes. And we had countryside stewardship back in the 90s, and then it got turned into higher level stewardship, HLS, which we joined in 2010, and that ran for 10 years. Well, it actually got extended for 12 years, and then they brought back countryside stewardship, which has many, many options in it, and many of them are duplicated by SFI. But SFI has been dressed up to be the natural successor to countryside stewardship. So we were still able to receive funding back in the BPS days, so pre-Brexit. We were able to receive funding for doing a lot of environmental actions through the countryside stewardship system. But the BPS was different. It stood alone. It had its own rules and didn't really encourage us to do anything other than drive the land pretty hard, because you got a flat rate payment per acre that you were farming, per hectare. And then depending on the prevailing market conditions for your different crops, you would farm your land as hard as you felt appropriate. But then that still stands, because if you're hell-bent on maximising profit from your land, you are likely to be a high input, high output, running a high input, high output system. And people will still be doing that. And that is the system that is likely to do more damage. I would regard it as higher risk, because you're putting a lot more money into your crop growing system in the hope that you're going to get maximum output to give you the biggest profit. But you've got the vagaries of the grain market, which goes up and down like a fiddler's elbow throughout the year. You can spread out your selling over a long period to try and soften that blow, but really there's no magic. We are price takers. There's nothing we can do to enhance the price of the basic crops that we grow, the wheats and the barleys. We have to accept the price that's offered. Right now it's quite low and doesn't, I wouldn't want to be a high input, high output grower right at the moment, because the prices don't offer the rewards that are likely to cover the costs of the much higher inputs, because fertilizer is a lot more expensive than it used to be. Chemicals are incredibly expensive. So we're trying to run a system that doesn't rely on those things anything like as much as we were 10 years ago.
And of course, the SFI payments would have helped to mitigate.
Absolutely. Well, the stewardship
costs.
payments back before the Brexit days and the change of the system, the big transition starting, we were relying on stewardship to give us rewards for the way we were farming, the bird food we produced, the habitat we created, on top of the BPS, and we needed it to remain profitable, to pay the rent, to be able to reinvest, and to be able to live. And we've continued to try and operate like that, have a balance between flat rate payments, as BPS has continued until this year, where it's actually been slashed by amount. We're going to get a tenth of what we got last year for 2025 of BPS, and we've tried to build up the sustainable farming incentive payments, but that brings us up to date, and suddenly that's been removed before we could actually make our application.
Now, the SFIs only came into effect a couple of years ago, and they were due to run for rather longer than just last month when they were axed, weren't they?
That's right. Well, especially if you consider that we've been led to believe by DEFRA that SFI would become the successor to countryside stewardship, mid-tier, because there are different layers of countryside stewardship, and I don't want to get bogged down in detail, but the stewardship that most people join is mid-tier, and many of the options in mid-tier stewardship are mirrored by SFI options. And so when your stewardship comes to an end, and our current stewardship agreement will end in 2027, we are expecting to be able to re-enter most of those options into the SFI of the day. Now, we don't know what that will look like. At the moment, we're being told it's going to be capped. And we get many thousands of pounds from stewardship. I don't really want to specify how much, because it's difficult to explain without full context. But it would make a massive difference if we lost our stewardship and weren't able to re-imply it into SFI in 2 years' time. So that is pretty nerve-wracking when we've seen trust destroyed at the press of a button where they've just switched off SFI. The contract between government and farmers has been shredded, because we're supposed to be making this transition into sustainable farming systems. But if suddenly, like Mr. Trump with his tariffs, it's turned on and turned off at the drop of a hat, nobody's going to risk going into it, and it's going to force us back to the old model of high input, high output farming, which offers, when the wind is blowing in the right direction and you get enough rainfall and it's dry at harvest time, offers you the best chance of a reasonable income. It's so destructive what they've done. Anyway, I'm jumping ahead of your questions.
Yes, so George, in a way, if one takes the gloomy view, the cessation of these environmentally friendly subsidies to farmers could mean that if farmers can't make any kind of a profit, they'll get out of business.
Some people might. I mean, the land will still exist, so I don't subscribe to the, particularly to the view in some quarters that farms being forced out of business is a disaster, because the land will still exist and somebody else will come in and do something with the land. But if that is a rich person, very wealthy person, buying it up to bury huge amounts of cash in with little exposure to inheritance tax, because let's be honest, the changes to inheritance tax that are proposed to come into effect next year are not going to stop people from doing that, because the inheritance tax levels are half what normal inheritance tax is. So if those sorts of people are going to continue to buy land where other proper farmers have found they're unable to make a living, then that's a huge question to me. Should we be allowing this? Where are we going to produce our food? Is that going to force us to produce to buy in more and more food from overseas, where we have no control over how it's produced? It leaves me nothing but with questions of that nature.
Now, George, are farmers in Dorset and elsewhere in the country left wondering if the British government has any understanding of the land and farming and how it all works and how it should ideally be looked after and managed?
Well, that's how it feels at the moment, Jenny, because the things they've done since they've been in office. And it's funny how it took them so long from July when they took office. It's taken them until March to realise that the SFI budget was unsustainable, sustainable in a different sense. What on earth was going on in DEFRA? You would think that when Steve Reed walked into the office in after July the 4th, the first thing that big boss civil servant would have said is, "Look, Steve, we've got these SFI payments which are too generous. Farmers are taking up certain ones. For the last 2 years, we haven't been able to persuade enough farmers to join, but something has now made them decide that it is a good idea to join, and we're committing to too many. Maybe the rates are too high. Maybe we should be capping it or something like that." But how is it that it took until March? And in between times, they announced that they were cutting BPS payments to a maximum of £7,500 per year, which for us is, we run a big farm, which we're fortunate to do, but it supports 6 or 7 families. We're going to lose several tens of thousands of pounds of income because of that change for next year. And then they announced the inheritance tax thing, which doesn't directly affect us as tenant farmers, but does threaten and worry a great many landowning farmers for a whole raft of reasons, which would take me several hours to explain properly. And I agree with some of the points, I disagree with others. But there is an issue, massive issue there. So that was a hit to the farming industry. And to do that before realising that the SFI was actually paying out too much money for farmers strikes me as just gross incompetence. I do not understand how DEFRA could have acted so incompetently, and to not understand that the destruction of trust that the removal of SFI, the pause or whatever they want to call it, of SFI is going to do, that the damage done by that takes my breath away. I cannot process it. It's so ridiculous. I can't see any defence for it at all. The damage they're going to do is unbelievable. It's taken years to get to this point where the original aim of SFI under the Tories was that 70% of farmers would engage with it. We've barely got to 50%, and they've switched it off because they say they're spending too much. Well, maybe some of the options are paying out too much, and they've allowed too many farmers to get funds for things that perhaps shouldn't be on the list. Well, whose fault is that? The NFU warned them about an awful lot of this stuff way back last year when they were talking about what options were going to be available. There's a list of 100 different options in the 2024 SFI, and I'm sure there are plenty in there that shouldn't be, and some of the 23 options also. And you can get funding for all sorts of other things from countryside stewardship, which maybe are too generous. But how is it that they've allowed it to run on for so long without tweaking it somewhere along the line, rather than just suddenly, with no warning, switching it off?
So reducing the payments, it does sound a little bit as if the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing.
That's an understatement. It sounds like, I've heard no explanation, no credible explanation at all, because what was happening at the highest levels in DEFRA? Who was responsible for the amounts of money that were being committed to farmers who were making applications? There's so many questions that we need answered. Clarity is what the NFU has been asking for, and we haven't had any yet. Yeah, it's a mystery to me, and I can't explain it. All I'm concerned about is the long-term effect on the way farmers will farm, and pulling the plug on SFI with no warning, with 6,000 applications like ours on the DEFRA's portal, but we were just waiting for a few more checks before we were able to press the button, and hopefully the scheme would have been accepted. There's 6,000 farmers in that position who've all decided to sign up to SFI, which is fantastic news, but then suddenly they say there's no money left. Well, where's all that money gone then? And they're not telling us, not with any clarity and honesty.
Is there, George, is there any sign of some form of payment to replace the SFI, especially with the very recent news that the British economy actually grew in February, so the government might perhaps be a bit plumper in the pocket than they'd thought?
I don't for a moment criticise the government because of the general catastrophic situation it faces with cash. I mean, if we believe half of what they tell us, they inherited a pretty stinking mess. And if if a Labour government has got the guts to slash welfare payments as they are saying they're going to, then farmers are small beer, aren't they? And if the problems are that big, well, they've got to do something somehow, somewhere. But I can't get involved in the macro politics of it because although I am interested, we've got to concentrate on the effect on the land because that's what matters. And SFI isn't going to be replaced. It would be ludicrous to do that because the government, two different governments, have spent an awful lot of time and effort building the SFI and the system to run it and generating all the rules and options available. And an awful lot of it is very, very, very positive in the way it's encouraging us to do the right thing. I've been staggered by how good it is. And the SFI 23 system, which we did subscribe some land to, worked really well on the government portal. So it worked. It pays out quarterly. You can apply at any time of year. It was terrific. But then they've gone over ambitious with the 24, and suddenly we've gone from an underspend of 300 million for 2 years running to an overspend of however much. I don't know how much. They say they've run out. Frankly, I don't believe it. I don't believe the levels of incompetence, but I'm concerned at the basic level. I'm concerned at the destruction of trust. What was becoming a successful move to persuade farmers to farm in a better, healthier way, that's out the window. And those doubters who always said, well, you don't want to be joining any of this nonsense, you just got to get on and farm your land properly.
So, George, finally, this sounds to me a little bit as if we may see more farmers demonstrating outside Westminster. Well,
we've done that, been there, done that, and it made no difference. Personally, I feel that was a complete and utter waste of time. I don't subscribe to what an awful lot of farmers have been saying about inheritance tax. I don't believe very many of them will be affected by it. Not the numbers that the NFU claims, but that's a very controversial view, and I'm pretty much in a minority of three
we'll steer
compared
clear
to the
of that
rest
one,
of the
shall we,
farming
George?
community. But I'm happy to debate it with people when they want to talk about it. But I think we overreacted to that as an industry, and that has left us in a poorer position to deal with something of a much more fundamental and consequential situation that we now face with how government are going to fund us. Do they want us to provide public goods for public money, or don't they? Because that's the message we've been getting loud and clear ever since that godforsaken decision to leave the EU. Now, I thought that the one positive thing that I could ever see out of Brexit was that we could do our own farming policy. And with SFI, that looked like it was heading very much in the right direction, something I felt was correct. But suddenly, even that has been shredded by the next government, with no sight of going back into the EU. The EU are slowly but surely grinding their way towards a more environmental way of farming. But the farming lobby in Europe is far more powerful than it is in the UK. And, we were on the right track to become much, much more environmentally friendly. And we still are, because there's a lot of farmers who've realised that that's the way we've got to go no matter what. But my goodness, the economics are absolutely vital to play correctly as well.
So finally, George, then, is the way you feel about the cessation, about the stopping of the SFI, and the anger that you quite clearly feel, is this shared by other farmers you've spoken to?
Very many other farmers, pretty much all. Many farmers who've realised that it was a bus that really needed to be got onto because the system was kind of bedding down, and there were some good options, and maybe some of them were paying too much. Well, the government needs to have the wit and the nimbleness of thought and activity to change it. If it looks like it's going in the wrong direction, well, make some changes and explain what you're doing and why you're doing it. But they haven't. They've just stopped it, and we have no idea what they're going to provide to replace it, if anything. So there's a lot of farmers, say if our stewardship was expiring this year, say it was expiring in September, there will be nothing to take its place, and suddenly we will be left thinking, new sowing season, we're going to have to plough out all this lovely habitat that we've created over the last 15 years and grow it back to crops again, because there will be no payments coming for it, because we get no return out of growing. We've got 75 hectares of flower-rich margins around every single arable field, which, are now peppered. If we were if you were interviewing me here, I'd be taking you out to look at the cowslips, which are just popping up now and looking absolutely gorgeous. And there'll be a number of other flowers coming up soon. The bees are out there. Early bees are supping on the cowslips and so on. And that will go on through the year. So, luckily, we've got 2 years before our scheme ends. But for those whose scheme is going to end now, they've got this awful decision to make, because they can't afford for 75 hectares to not be earning them anything, and if it's a rented farm like ours, we're up the flipping creek without a paddle. That's what we're facing. Individual farmers, the situation will be different for every farm, but they'll have different schemes that they've joined at different times, which have an expiry date. The SFI only lasts 3 years. The stewardship lasts 5 now, so you don't really have very long. That's a tiny amount of time in the farming calendar, and I'm so saddened by this move. It shows a complete lack of understanding. You said about the question about whether the government really understands farming at all, and I thought they had. The NFU put a lot of effort into talking to Labour well before they were elected, because we could see, which way the water was flowing, so to speak. And we thought they got some of it. But to have acted like this, they clearly don't. Having said that, the appointment of Minette Batters to the role that's been announced in the last week is a glimmer on the horizon. She's very smart, very well-grounded, practical farmer herself. The question will she be producing a report that will then be put on a shelf and will gather dust and it won't make a difference? I don't know. Or is it going to be a way to enable the government to actually get themselves off this terrible hook that they've got themselves on? It's a glimmer of hope.
Well, we can only hope that will be the case, as George Hosford says.
And that's about it for episode 2 of April's podcast. Do join Jenny again next month, but for the final time, it's goodbye from me, Terry Bennett.
And it's goodbye from me, Jenny Devitt. And personally, I'm very sorry that my friend and colleague Terry is having to leave us. But I'll be back with you in the merry month of May. Bye-bye.